Welcome to the podcast. Eric is the autobiography of my grandfather, Eric Langridge. He was born in 1925 in just central London. His early days were described in the first episode, simple joys, but absolute poverty. As he and his brother Lionel got older, they got into mischief. One day, they returned home to find that their mum had gone on a holiday, one from which she would never return. His father, unable or unwilling to cope, surrendered them to a children's home outside of London. The last episode in this one described what life was like for my grandfather and the other boys who were what he referred to as inmates at St. Luke's.
The home we had been put into was called St. Luke's, but we were called Lukey Boys by all and sundry. I was very lucky once. One of the boys gave me some bubblegum, which I cheerfully accepted and started to chew straight away. I was caught and reported by the teacher. When I got back to the home, I dreaded what was going to happen. It was tea time and I was called to the front. He looked livid and asked me what I had been eating. I told him it was a piece of blotting paper. He left to get the cane, I thought, but he came back with a long strip of blotting paper, which he stuffed in my mouth, and I had to stand there and chew, all through the mealtime and for the rest of the evening. At bedtime, he told me to spit the ball of paper into the wastebasket. Then he whacked me round the head and warned me not to do it again. Mealtimes were always fraught with danger, as it was usually the time when he would pick on us boys. We had to learn our weekly menus, and before we started the meal, we had to describe what was on our plate. Fridays was easy, as it was always fish, but on some days it was not so easy. We had stews on 2 days, and they were dreadful. It was made with very cheap cuts of beef taken from the shin. The stew was full of lumps of fatty, grisly meat. It took ages to chew and was even more difficult to swallow. The vegetables were hard, but we left nothing on our plates. We used to dread these meals. Another bad meal was the breakfast porridge, or we called it pongo. It was made with very coarse oats, with husks and all. It was put in the saucepan overnight, and by morning it was well done and the bottom of the pan had burnt. So each bowlful would have large lumps of skin in it. The stuff was tacky and the husks would stick in the back of your throat. Nothing could be left in the bowl. All of our meals were accompanied by them at the head table, so we knew their beady eyes were on us, watching for any bad eating habits. There were also times when they would call out the good boys for a special treat. If they had boiled eggs, the boys would get the shells to clear out the egg white. Also, they were allowed any crusts of toast that were left. If they had baked potatoes, the boys would get the skins. There were always goodies like this, and we would all be on our best behavior and try to catch the matron's eye. Tea time would be bread and jam or golden syrup. The bread was cut in 1-inch thick slices. We would get 1.5 slices for the big boys and 1 slice for the little ones. The bread was made with very coarse flour and always seemed to be dry. It was prepared in the kitchen under Miss Polly's supervision. All the bread was laid out on the huge table, and there was a bowl of melted margarine on the aga. 2 boys used a large pastry brush and spread the margarine across the bread. It was a hit and miss affair, and we often finished up with dry bread on the corners or sides. Miss Polly would have made a large slab of fruit cake or chocolate cake, which was cut up into chunks, and the right amount placed on a plate in the center of each table. No one touched the cake until the top boys had theirs first. This meant the rest had the corners and crusty bits. Supper time was always bread and drippings. The bread slices were 2 inches thick and those cut into 4 pieces. We had a quarter piece each, thick with drippings. If one was lucky, he would get the jelly from the bottom of the bowl. This was washed down with a cup of cocoa. After tea time each day, and when all the housework was done, we were returned to the classroom, not for playtime, but to read our books, learn our catechism, or to collect for each Sunday. Thursdays and Fridays were choir practice nights. The choir, well, that was something else. All the boys were expected to be in it, and if you were a new boy, you were in for some rough treatment. I was earmarked for this and was told to stand by the piano and sing the do-re-mi bit. Well, he went mad. No, 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 he raved. Start again and listen to the music. This went on until he was like a trembling jelly and tears were welling up in my eyes. He finally slapped my head and told me to sit down. I was useless. I sat down, but I didn't give in. I didn't cry. We carried on learning, and eventually he was satisfied with my efforts. I had a lovely voice. In choir practice, we learned the hymns, the psalms, and the anthem for specific festival Sundays. These were grueling sessions and went on and on until we were word and tone perfect. The teaching did us a lot of good, and at times we were very proud to perform in front of the congregation. The trouble was, the master also played the organ over which there was placed a long wide mirror. He could see all of the choir and he was looking for faults. It was only at Sunday dinner time that he would call us out and tell us what he had seen. One was singing through his teeth, or another was looking around in prayers, or another not paying attention to the sermon, so it went on. The punishment usually meant we had no pudding, or if he thought it was really bad, we were made to stand up in the front and have no dinner. The worst things we had to learn were the anthems or psalms. They both had long sentences, and there never seemed enough music to fit in all the words. We had to do them over and over again until he was satisfied. We went to bed exhausted. Even the vicar knew what was going on, but he was no help. Not even when he heard the boys' confessions. He was on the home committee. Saturday afternoon was playtime and we were allowed out to play cricket, football or other games. This was until tea time, after which it was rehearsal time for the Sunday services. He would be at the piano, but first he would call on a boy to name the hymn numbers or something else he had learned. Whether it was a saint day or any other spiritual Sunday, these were never easy evenings. Our religious upbringing was according to the Church of England, which meant we used a common book of prayer and hymns ancient and modern. It was a very high church service that used various chants during the service, especially with the responses. We also used incense throughout the service. At one stage of my career, I was made a server, which meant I walked beside the vicar with a small bowl of incense dust. He would sprinkle this on the burner now and again. We proceeded through and around the church stalls, swinging the burner from side to side. I loved the smell of the incense. Our duties at the church services had to be earned. This meant we had to have knowledge of the order of service. We could carry out the various duties without a word being spoken. We were in church before the congregation for a meeting in the vestry. It was a rundown of the service. We put markers in the Bible for reference, also in the book of prayer. We also marked the right music as well, so there were no slip-ups. We all became very efficient and were often tested by the master. We knew when he would strike, so while we were carrying out our house duties, we would be memorizing the services. It was a very intensive part of our training and discipline. I remember on one occasion we gave a performance of John Stamer Crucifixion, which was acclaimed perfect in the local press. We were a very good choir and very proud of it. We put on special occasions and gave a lot of joy to the church. It was such a pity that it all had to be learned under such duress and hardship. But at the end of it all, we all had good voices and a good knowledge of music. We had a variety of chores to do during our training, and some of them were quite willing to do as a chance to get out of the classroom. One such chore was the production of firewood. The master would purchase a lorry load of wood blocks which were delivered at the front gate. The boys would form a line and the blocks were passed along to the woodshed. This was a large wooden building, hidden away behind a tall laurel hedge. Inside, there were 2 very long workbenches. The logs were all stacked very neatly at one end of the building. This had to be done properly with no chance of them falling down. By the time we had finished the stack, it would be about 4 feet high and 3 or 4 rows deep. It was a lot of logs. On these days, we would assemble in the hall and then march into the shed. We were all in the position that we would be in at the benches. There were 4 senior boys at each end for the serious work, and the middle-aged boys would be working in the center. The little ones would be in the background waiting for instructions for what they had to do. The first group of small boys were at the stack, and they would pass the logs up onto the bench. Then the first 4 senior boys would proceed to split the logs up into kindling-sized sticks. That's why they were there, old enough and responsible enough to use the choppers. The sticks would gradually mount up so the next group moved them on, and the sticks were arranged in a long line and sorted for size. 2/3 of the way along the bench, there were 4 working places for the next senior boys. 2 blocks of wood about 6 inches high and 4 inches apart were nailed to the bench top. In the meantime, the eldest of the small boys was busy cutting lengths and string to correct sizes. They had a board with 2 nails at the exact length apart, and these lengths of string were then placed across the 2 blocks. The bundles of wood were placed between the blocks to the right height, and then the strings were tied in a special way so that they did not come undone. When the bundles were tied, the last job was for a senior boy, who would hammer in slivers of wood like wedges until the bundles were packed tightly. Finally, the little boys would be stacking the bundles against the wall, nearest the door, ready for collection. They would then be sold to the hardware shop for sale as firelight and wood. Another hard chore we had was gardening. This was a real backbreaker. Behind the local bakery was a huge plot of derelict land, which was offered to the home as an allotment. It really was derelict, full of old iron, timber, and huge bramble bushes and stinging nettles everywhere. So we were all involved, from the smallest to the most senior boys. The first thing was to clear the ground, a job that took weeks. Everything was picked up and dragged to the far end of the plot. There were no wheelbarrows, and our poor little hands were cut and very sore. Eventually the ground was cleared and the digging had to start. All but the smallest were given a spade and we had to form a line across the plot. We just dug the ground up and left it in a rough state to allow the weather to work on it and the frost to help sterilize it. In the spring we had to go back to it and redig it all once again. Only this time it had to be more methodical and done properly to the master's satisfaction. Soon the potatoes and seed were sown and the continuous raking and hoeing had to be kept up. Bear in mind that through all of this, we were continually harangued and punished for any mistakes or carelessness. It was a real nightmare. The master also had his own tennis court, which was his pride and joy. It was a sunken lawn with a bank all around it, about 2 feet high. The surface was sown with a very fine grass and was as fine as a billiard table. Our task was to make up a line of boys on our knees to crawl along and pick up any stones that might injure his mower. The mower was a huge hand machine, so when he used it, 2 boys were in front pulling it along with a rope. He would be at the handle, raving and shouting as though we were a pair of horses. There were no rewards either. Our final task would be as ball boys whenever he played tennis matches, and we dared not make many mistakes either. All of these chores were carried out in our so-called free time, only after all of our normal house duties and schoolwork were completed. We were also involved in another very hard task around about November. It was the start of preparation for our Christmas appeal. There were huge boxes of cards and envelopes delivered, totaling 50,000 in all. We were all made to sit at our desks for this job. At the start, we were given huge bundles of cards and envelopes that were addressed back to the head office at Kennington, London. We had to place the addressed envelope inside each card. This had to be done very neatly so that the card would not fall out. These were then stacked up into bundles and the small boys would come around picking them up to place them in their original boxes. This went on every night, apart from the choir night, until this first stage was completed. Next, we were all handed bundles of addressed envelopes for the general public, and then the first bundles were handed out and we had to place them into the envelopes. The flaps were tucked in and the finished bundles stacked up. Once again, the small ones would gather them up and place them into their boxes, and so it went on until we were all done. The final stage came when every bundle was handed out, and this time we had long strips of stamps and put one on every envelope at the right-hand corner, a 1/4-inch border around each stamp, perfectly done. Then they went back into the boxes ready for final collection. All of this to solicit further donations. It was a dreadful month. In the meantime, our Christmas carol services had to be learned and rehearsed until we were word perfect. We also went carol singing around to all of the posh houses by invitation only, and as a further boost to our funds. The people were very nice to us and used to come around with a tin of sweets. We were allowed to take 2 each, but not for eating. We still had more singing to do. They were kept in our pocket, and when we got home they were placed into a bowl so that they could be shared with the small ones who didn't go singing. When we did get home, we were assembled for the master's little chat. All mistakes in singing were mentioned, being nosy in other people's houses, and the offense that I had unwittingly committed. One of the houses had a beautiful black Labrador which I had made a big fuss over, thereby delaying the start of singing. I was hauled out in front of the boys and berated and humiliated. I didn't get a wallop, but his anger was enough, and all this was at Christmas time. This section of the autobiography my grandfather titled Punishments. The home itself was situated in an isolated position outside of the village and surrounded by a very high wall, so we couldn't see out and no one could see in. No one knew what was going on inside, and those that did were no friend of ours. We already had the cane as a punishment and were amazed that our teachers hadn't recognized our bad hands. One day it was announced that the cane would no longer be used. Hooray, the cry went up and there was a great excitement. But we soon found our happiness short-lived. His next weapon was a hairbrush. For minor faults, we would be rapped on the knuckles, quite painful. For our real punishment, we would be whacked on the bare backside, not only humiliating, but very, very painful. Our bottoms were red, raw, and bruised, and now it was a case of not being able to sit down. He was just as brutal with the brush as he had been with the cane. It was a punishment that would not be seen like our hands were, but the teachers must have known how we were uncomfortable at sitting down, but still no help. This went on for month after month until suddenly this form of punishment was dropped. We never knew why or who had ordered it. We knew we had visits from inspectors from the head office, but these were always announced in advance. We had our school uniform on, playing games in the classroom and special meals, and so yet again we were passed with flying colours as a very nice, happy home. But as soon as they were gone, it was back to normal. We'd head upstairs to change, then back to the classroom, and had to be quiet. Christmas was always a joy for us, and we looked forward to it, especially after the November appeals and all the choral learning and services. After midnight mass on Christmas Eve, we looked forward to a relaxation. Quite a lot of the boys had been sent parcels, and they had been put away in a cupboard until the great day. After a very nice dinner of chicken, stuffing, and roast potatoes, we assembled in the schoolroom, and the parcels were handed out. We were allowed to open them, but all the contents were to be placed on top of the desk. The master then came around looking at the piles of toys, and he would take some from each of them. These extras were then handed to the boys who had nothing. It was a hard way to learn that sharing was the right thing to do. It brought tears to the eyes of many boys. We were allowed to eat our sweets and 1 bar of chocolate. Then we could play with our toys until tea time. We then spent the evening being very quiet and reading our books. It was because by then the matron had been through enough and couldn't stand the sight of us. She was always like this and was never very well. This was the excuse for a lot of the misery she caused us. And so another year started and things began as normal. We had all been there long enough to know the rules and routines. It all started at 7 a.m. every morning. We were called up by the senior boys and they only called us once. The master and the matron were already up and would soon be doing their rounds. We all had to be up and dressed and standing at the foot of our beds. The top sheet and blanket would be turned back to the foot of the bed, and he would examine the bottom sheets to see that none had been soiled. This was fine for all the bigger boys as he went from room to room, but when he got to the small boys' back bedroom there was uproar. We could hear him ranting and raving. Punishments would be handed out at breakfast time. In the meantime, the first room boys would have made their beds, and around he came again, sometimes accompanied by matron. We knew there would be trouble then. The beds had to be perfect. The pillows puffed up and straight, the top sheet turned down about a foot over the blanket, and the sides straight and with envelope corners. But it didn't matter how careful we had been. Matron would always find fault, ripping off all the bedding and making us start again. We were in trouble yet again. We would all be made to stand at our breakfast tables and wait for him to come in. He would have a list in his hands and would call out the boys' names and the punishment due to each. Then it was time to put our boots on and assemble in the hall ready for the march to school. We formed a long train of boys in pairs and would march to school in a quiet, disciplined manner, 4 senior boys in front and 4 behind. We were unmistakable in our grey uniforms and in line, so we used to receive a lot of jibes and many poked fun at us. School was just another version of the home under scrutiny all the time. We were almost afraid of acting normal like the other schoolboys. We would march home, then back at dinner time, and then home again for tea. On Monday tea times, we had to bring our exercise books with us to write down and learn the week's menu. Monday's dinner was always macaroni with cheese. It was a stodgy lump cut out in squares with boiled potatoes. Those still had the eyes in them and black bruises, and we had to eat the lot. Tuesday would be those dreaded stew days I mentioned previously. Wednesday would be a cold meat day, usually meatloaf and mash with gravy. Not bad and one meal we usually enjoyed. Thursday was another stew day, but this time made with mutton, but it had a pastry top. Once again it was fatty and was a job to swallow, but the best bit was the pastry. Friday was always fish day, nearly always boiled with mash. Sometimes we had a sauce with it, either parsley or white sauce. It didn't help much though. It was so runny it made the dinner worse. And very rarely we had soused herrings, which Miss Polly made, and that was very good. Saturday was soup day, one that we enjoyed. It would be beef and vegetables, which had been finely minced. The soup was nice and thick, and we had it all. In fact, it was the only meal we could have seconds, especially if Miss Polly made too much. Sundays were cold meat days. Miss Polly was quite adept at making meatloaf or brawn and salt beef. It had to be a cold meal because of the day's church services. There was no time to cook. We might have salad, but mostly it was mash. All the dinners were accompanied with a pudding. They varied according to how much time Miss Polly had to make them. Her life was not much better than ours. It was nothing to hear Matron ranting at her, and her duties never ended. Amongst our favourite puddings was roly-poly, which was suet and flour mixed with raisins and currants. This was wrapped in a cloth and boiled, and it was delicious. We also enjoyed Miss Polly's rice pudding. It was thick, cold, and would be cut into squares. It was sweet and lovely. We sometimes had prunes and custard, more of a medicinal than a sweet pudding. The worst pudding was tapioca, which would be thick, stodgy, and a job to eat. It stuck to the roof of our mouths. Other puddings throughout the year varied according to contributions made by friends at the home. One such occasion was at the end of the Feast of Passover. There was a large Jewish community in this area. When the feast was finished, all the food left over was brought to us boys. It was in a huge laundry basket about 3 foot by 2 foot deep. It would be full of lovely sandwiches, pies, and other goodies. It was placed at the head of the dining room, and we all carried our plates and were allowed 3 sandwiches each. This would last for 2 days, and we really lived well. But there were also 1-gallon cans of olive oil which we had to take, about an egg cupful twice a week. Yuck.